on and where we can actually give in our recommendations, and if there are any avenues where we can actually make some changes or make some dents in the entire policy, in the entire budgetary process. So that is one of the major, this was one of the major important activity for the FPC when we collected together, and this was also one of the very important tasks for us to have convened this pre-budget consultation, to have a set of recommendations. For in the last few years, we have been doing this. Of course, we all know, all of us who have gathered here, we all know that it is becoming more and more difficult to get anything through with the regime in terms of making some headways into any policy discourse. But I think there is some interest of the Ministry of Women and Child Development in gender responsive budgeting, which is something that the Feminist Policy Collective is absolutely committed to look at the gender responsive budgeting from a very alternative lens and a very transformative lens, to bring in gender equality into its view. And so this year's consultation looks at the entire process of feminist recovery pathways, what can be done, and also recommend into the budgetary processes. So we are convening a little earlier than every year that we have done so. With us, we have as the keynote speaker a very eminent person who actually needs no introduction to this audience. We have Professor Jayati Ghosh, who has been teaching, me included, a lot of people in the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and right now is also faculty at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And we are very happy to have her with us. I do not have to get into introducing her about her recognition, her acclamations, and the way she has been, what she has been doing. So, we do have 5 minutes before we start, but I think I'll hand over to Jayati for making her keynote and giving us direction in terms of what we should be doing and what kinds of things we should be looking at in this year's budgetary process, focusing more on women's issues. Thank you so much, and over to you, Jayati.
Thank you so much, Shona, and it's really such a pleasure, even virtually. We're so starved of interaction nowadays that even meeting virtually is a big pleasure, and it's nice to see so many people among the participants whom I wish I could meet in person as well. But anyway, I'm not going to spend too much time on all of that background, because we may as well get on to the business at hand. Once again, having looked at the list of participants, I think everything I'm going to say is well known to all of you. So it's really reiterating things that you have already thought about and have experienced and get feedback from all your different constituencies. But let me just highlight, first of all, the macroeconomic context. Then secondly, if you like, the political economy context, which is very important, especially, I don't have to tell all of you who have been doing this kind of budget analysis for so long, but the political economy context, which is absolutely essential. And then briefly, what I think should be done in terms of focusing both expenditures and revenue generation strategies. And then also, when budgets are released, or even before they're released, what we should be highlighting and flagging. So in terms of the context, it's no secret that the economy is in collapse. Despite all this talk of V-shaped recovery and all of this, there are some, India is actually exceptional in terms of how bad things are. We are among the worst performing economies in terms of livelihood rebound. Our livelihood has not rebounded. So first of all, we had a larger than normal collapse in livelihood, and that was really because of the very severe way in which the lockdown was first imposed and then implemented. We had one of the most stringent lockdowns in the world, probably the most stringent in its early phases, imposed like a military curfew, which denied, at very short notice with no warning, so that people could not prepare either. And we followed that up with almost next to no compensation, very, very little compensation in terms of the incomes lost during that period. And again, this is not news. The various schemes and packages that were announced by the government as relief measures were nowhere near anything that could compensate the dramatic loss in income for between 4 to 6 months, in many cases, absolute loss of income. Many surveys have found that between 30 to 40% of the workers they interviewed had no income over the period from end of March till late July. And even those who did then get incomes after that got between 50 to 70% of the money returns that they had got earlier. So dramatic collapses in income, first none, and then very, very dramatic collapses over the subsequent period. Most recent surveys have found that even a year after the lockdown was imposed, and well after that, in fact, in July 2021, that many workers have not even got 80% of what they were getting before in terms of wage incomes or incomes from self-employment. This collapse in livelihood had a very strong association with the fiscal response, or shall I say the lack of it. So we have seen that across the world, I mean, the advanced economies went to town, right? They forgot all of their talk of, fiscal discipline and everything. Suddenly none of that mattered. So you had fiscal expansion of anywhere between 10 to 30% of GDP, additional spending, okay? I mean, that's the kind of additional money we're talking about, bigger than FDR's New Deal, bigger than anything we have experienced out of wartime, okay? Of course, there was a big North-South divide in this. We know that of the IMF estimates that between January 2020 and March 2021, there was about 11 trillion additional spend. Oh, sorry, July 2020. So between January 2020 and July 2021, the IMF estimates that there was additional government spending beyond what would have been the norm of around $11 trillion globally. 80% of that came from just 10 countries. The rich countries, no surprises there. 55% of that came just from the US alone. To give you another sense of that global inequality, the US spent on average about, I think it's anywhere between $25,000 to $30,000 per capita. Additionally, the low-income countries spent additionally $2 per capita. 2, okay? So 25,000 and 2. That's the difference in terms of the per capita spending. Among the G20 countries, India is one of the worst. India and Mexico did the least additional spending. But in Mexico, much of the spending was redirected towards the social sector. So while Mexico was also very fiscally disciplined, macroeconomically, they did not actually spend much more. They redirected a lot of their spending towards social protection, towards the social sectors, health and nutrition and so on. In India, we didn't do that. We did not spend more additionally. We spent only 8% more in monetary terms, with inflation at 6%. So you know that we spent basically 2% more than we had the previous year, which is unimaginable in a year of such massive, massive devastation and not just pandemic, but the costs imposed by the lockdown. So we did not have a fiscal response that was required, and we were unusual. No other country did this extreme stringency in fiscal spending, combined with this complete lack of social protection. Really no additional social protection other than a relatively small amount going for food and the 5 kilograms per capita per month, and a relatively small amount, in fact, so small that it's embarrassing. The money going into Jan Dhan accounts, 500 rupees. I mean, that it's so small that one can even discount that altogether. And it turns out that even a lot of the declarations that were made in the various packages did not fructify, did not actually get spent. So one of the things I would really beseech all of you to do well before the budget is to look at those announcements once again quite carefully and look at the CGA, the Controller General of Accounts, that database, to see how much has actually been spent in this period, both in the previous financial year and in the ongoing financial year. We have the data now, I think, until September. And so we have a sense of how much has been actually spent. The numbers are shocking. I don't remember the exact numbers, but you can go and look yourself. The numbers are absolutely terrifying in terms of how little has been spent. Now, what's the implication of this? It's very, very important, because not only does it impact on the things that affect human welfare and women's conditions in particular, but it also has a macroeconomic impact. So the fact that the government did not compensate by spending more in a period when private spending was necessarily collapsing. Okay, people, first of all, are deprived of incomes, and anyway, they can't consume. There's very little, the proportion of the population that can do the online ordering and spending is relatively small, unlike, again, most other countries, including other developing and emerging market countries. So we really had a major collapse in consumption. And then because consumption has collapsed, the market has collapsed, you have a decline in investment. No surprises, right? I mean, why will private investment occur? First of all, when you can't even go out there and do any physical expansion, but also when there's no market. In that situation, the government is the only agency that can actually somehow shore up the economy. And so a lot of the fiscal spending in the advanced countries and in other G20 countries, Brazil, for example, much larger, South Africa, much larger, all of China, though I'm leaving out because China is exceptional in every possible way. But a lot of that was simply to prevent the broader macroeconomic collapse. So that's why India had such a sharp decline, and that's why the recovery, we are saying, I mean, that it's 8%, 8.5%, 9%. That is hugely debatable, because that estimate of the recovery is based really on formal sector performance. We now know that the national income accounts, ever since the change in the base year and the different weights and so on, the methodology has also changed. So whether it is manufacturing or it is formal services, it relies on company reports. It relies on self-declared advance estimates that companies declare about their own performance. We know that the corporate sector has done very well, even when the rest of the economy is going down a tube, is really collapsing completely. And that means that we are pretending that what's happening in the corporate sector is translating to the rest of the economy. We know that the informal sector, informal economy, which was already in terrible shape because it was disproportionately hit by demonetization and then by GST, and then, of course, the pandemic, where in the absence of any kinds of social protection, the informal sector is left with nothing. Micro, small enterprises, self-employed people, zero assistance. All you get is the permission to borrow more and to postpone your debt repayments, not forgo them, but postpone them, which is not much of an advantage. That's all that we gave them. And as a result, we've had dramatic collapses in the informal economy, which are not captured in our national income data because the CSO is not doing the surveys required. So I think another demand that we have to make as women, as feminists, is that we have to collect the data that show us what is in fact the state of the informal economy and what is the appropriate size of the formal versus informal. The latest survey was done, the last survey was done in 2004-05, years ago. So that's really, it doesn't tell us. And since then, we know that the informal sector has been disproportionately battered. So to rely on national income data that still assumes that same proportion of around 60-40 was the estimate then, that informal activities account for 40% of GDP. That's nonsense now. We know that the informal economy has been battered. And that if you actually take into account what's happening in the informal economy, you will get a very different GDP. So we need to demand that the statistical system actually does the kind of survey that would enable it to estimate the size of the informal economy and the number of people dependent on it. We're still going by the 85% number, which again comes from 2004-5. Whereas this this particular shift that has happened has also meant that the formal economy hasn't grown in employment as it should have been doing over this time. In GDP, it's grown, but employment, it hasn't grown, okay? So those are the two statistical issues which are making it much more difficult for all of us who look at all the secondary data of the Indian economy to actually be able to get a sense of what is actually happening. So what's the bottom line on all of this? That actually the economy is in much worse shape than we are told by the official data or by officialdom in general, by the ministries and so on, in terms of how the economy is performing. We have to bear that in mind. And we have to recognize that, especially in terms of livelihood and employment issues, we are in a very, very deep crisis. Okay, now some of that is kind of obvious. Unfortunately, the real-time data that we have, the periodic labor force surveys were supposed to be real-time. They're not quite as real-time as we would like. And many of us have been then relying on the CMIE, the private Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy database, which has a number of issues, okay, which is disproportionately biased to urban, formal sector, male employment, and is not really good at capturing women's participation in quite the same way. So we don't have adequate handles, but the handles that we do have are telling us about livelihood collapse. There's no question about it. And about wage collapses as well, money wage collapses. So the situation is very dire. And of course, again, no surprises, within this dire situation, women are much worse off, okay? So much evidence that women were disproportionately thrown out of jobs in a situation where already we had one of the lowest women's workforce participation rates in the world, recognized employment participation in the world, okay? So the pandemic has been really brutal in terms of women's ability to access paid work. It's been, and younger women in particular, there is a lot of evidence that even if it's not reflected always in open unemployment, in some cases it is. I mean, in urban India, we find very, very high rates of open unemployment of young women in particular. But overall, there is a decline in the labor force participation as well. Discouraged worker effect is very strong. And we find that women are really not in a position now to access paid employment on even the conditions that existed before, which were terrible, right? So very, very, very bad news. This is a setback of, which will take years to recover from. And then, of course, there's the impact on education, which is something that is very important for us to think about, because once again, whenever there are inadequacies and budgetary gaps and lack of spending in education, it's the girls who typically suffer more, whether it's within households or it's in schools, and it's in the communities and so on. So less girls going into secondary and higher secondary schooling, girls have disproportionately suffered in the pandemic when we had so-called online teaching, if you know. And so many of these surveys have discovered not only that, of course, children from poorer families, children in more distant locations and less well-connected locations, children from the less privileged castes suffered disproportionately. But within families, if you have one mobile phone and you need that for schooling, or you can give some hours of the day for schooling, and there are two children and one of them is a girl, it's much less likely that the girl will get access. And this has been found in survey after survey that looked at children's access to online classes. There is a real fear of a lost generation. I've been talking about, many years lost in terms of employment generation, but we are talking about almost 2 years of no schooling, for many children for whom, they're first generation learners, their parents have low levels of literacy or low levels of education, they have lost everything. They've forgotten everything. I mean, surveys, and even just today, I was talking to a friend who has been doing surveys in Jharkhand along with Jandres, and there are children who have forgotten everything. There are children who are supposedly now in class 5 who have forgotten their letters. They've forgotten how to add and subtract. And that kind of collapse in learning, which, in other governments across the world, you find that they are setting aside significant additional money to make up for that loss. Because this is the kind of thing that requires individual attention. It requires what we would call private tuition, but not privately, delivered by the public school system to individual students, because that kind of massive collapse in learning capacities, you can't make up in a general class. You can't just pretend that, okay, 2 years, we were asleep and now we've woken up and we start again. It's a much, much bigger thing, but that requires massive expenditure, and it actually requires a retraining, first of all, many, many more teachers, but a retraining of those teachers to deal with that additional backlog, if you like, of learners. And then, of course, there's a problem that there were 2 years of children who never got into school. And the ones who were in class 1 before, let's face it, they should officially now in class 3, but they don't know anything. So they should be back in class 1. And so there's all of that mess in our school systems, which needs to be sorted out, which will necessarily require massive funding. You cannot do this without funds. It's not the only solution, but yes, you have to put money into this as well. So that's the next big concern that we have to worry about. Food, nutrition. I mean, again, the surveys are horrifying. And as it is, we had in some of our states nutrition indicators. If those states were countries, we would be in the bottom 10 of the world. That is, 4 of our states would be the worst performing in the world. Okay, down there with some of the most so-called famine-ridden, nutritionally deprived countries in Africa. So we are talking about a very severe decline in nutrition, which can only partly be compensated by the distribution of just basic food grain. Because a lot of that nutritional decline is also in terms of the decline in other parts of the diet, which are essential for a well-balanced diet. So we really have to rethink our food distribution system and do what some states are doing. Tamil Nadu and Kerala already do this. Andhra Pradesh and Telangana also, to a lesser extent, do this. They provide a larger range of items in the public distribution system. And we should be arranging for some of these to actually be provided at much lower cost or free to a whole range of people. Midday meals didn't exist for a very long time. And the period when things opened up, schools did not open, as you know. Very few states compensated families for that midday meal by providing them anything. And mostly it was just, again, grain. Whereas the whole point is to get a rounded, somehow balanced diet. The midday meal provided a little bit of that, at least for some school-going children. But that also was lost over this entire period. ICDS, the Anganwadis were closed, and in most states, they have not opened even now. And once again, very few states compensated in terms of providing dry rations, but these dry rations, again, largely in the form of food grain. So we really have to rethink the whole food basket that we are providing, because we are going to now face, I won't even call it a crisis, a nutritional catastrophe in this country, in terms of the evidence, which is actually remarkably already there in terms of higher stunting rates during the pandemic, significant BMI declines. I mean, all kinds of things going on, even during which are supposedly things that happen over long periods. They're not supposed to happen suddenly, but because we have experienced such a major economic shock without adequate compensation and without adequate provision of these basics, these necessities, we are getting these things that happen in countries, when you hear of these in great famines. You heard of this in the Great Leap Forward. You heard of this in the Soviet Union when it collapsed in Russia. That's the kind of thing we're experiencing in India today in terms of the nutritional indicators already. So clearly it's a huge kind of massive shock that has to be dealt with through significantly increased public expenditure. And because we didn't spend it in the past year and a half, we have to spend it now. We did not compensate from April 2020 onwards, as we should have done. The required expenditure now is even larger, okay? Now, in terms of the other aspect of what has happened during the pandemic, the fiscal response so far during the pandemic, the other really big shock, and again, it's unusual, we are really rare in the world for relying so much on regressive taxation, for increasing our reliance on taxes that disproportionately hit the poor and the disadvantaged. And the most obvious example of that is the fuel tax, which has increased, I think 550% is one estimate in the last 4 years. But it's a massive reliance on fuel taxes, which falls, as we all know, largely on the poor. And this comes in addition to the fact that the spending has not been directed to the poor. We began before the pandemic, we had just been, we had given away this big present to corporates in the form of a tax relief, which was not then justified by any increased investment. And so to make that up and to deal with the fact that other revenues were collapsing because the economy had collapsed or had frozen really for several months, there was this huge increase in fuel taxes, which is now, there's a little bit of a political attempt to bring it down slightly because it's getting to be a hot potato, and because there are state assembly elections coming up. I think we need to be in no doubt about what has caused the minor decline. But even with that minor decline, this fuel tax it's way out of whack with what it should be, and it's way out of whack with how revenues should be raised. Okay, so that's, if you like, the broad background, the context in which we have to ask for things. So what do we ask for? Well, first of all, we have to ask for more reliable data. And I don't mean this in the very general way that, we always end a lot of our workshops and seminars by saying we need more data, we need more gender disaggregated data, Of course, we need all that. But right now, we need to even bring our data back to the degree of reliability that they had, say, 10 years ago. At the moment, our national income data is not reliable. And that's critical, right? I mean, not that I'm a big believer in GDP as an indicator of any human progress or anything, but so much else depends on the way that we interpret the GDP, that we really need to have a reliable indicator. And in particular, the fact that the informal economy has been so badly battered in the past, especially since 2016, has been so badly battered in the past 5 years, that we need to have a proper survey done by the CSO to indicate the actual size of informal sector, informal activities, and the proportion of people employed by the informal sector. We must have that kind of information. And we cannot try and dress it up by claiming that anybody who has an EPFO account is a formal worker, because we know that that's not true. We know that many workers get an EPFO number and then it lies there dormant. They think it's another tax on their wages. They don't even realize they have a right to it. When they move jobs, that's the end of it. They do not realize the portability, or else the employers do not enable that portability. And this is widespread. This is evident. Even we did a small survey in the National Capital Region a couple of years ago, actually 4 years ago now. But anyway, we did the survey to realize that all of those who had EPFO were basically informal workers. They had worked briefly in a factory or in some company and they had got this account, but that was it. And none of them had got any benefit from that. So we need proper data, first of all. And I think this really should be a demand. In terms of exactly what is the state of the economy and the state of the different sectors. But in addition, we also need much more data on the specific sectors that women are employed in, and that the specific sector they have been thrown out of, or in which their employment has become much more unreliable, shall I say. And this is where another aspect of the pandemic period and the macroeconomic response and the monetary policy response is really very important. The extent to which microfinance institutions were hit is something that I believe has been relatively understudied. I'm not saying there's been nothing, there have been a few, but it's not been given the kind of wider kind of prominence that it deserves. Because, whether we like it or not, the whole NABARD, microfinance, SBL linkage, all of that had some impact in some livelihood arrangements for self-employed women. In some states, like in Kerala and the Kutumba Shri, it was crucial in enabling women to actually function. In a bunch of other states, microfinance institutions and the loans they provided through the whole SBL and so on were critical in at least providing some cushion, some buffer of small productive activities, however, minor, but nonetheless adding a bit to household incomes, or the consumption buffer, as we know. Now, microfinance institutions have been under great stress. And this is coming to a head now, because that whole loan moratorium phase is over. What did that do? That basically said, you don't have to pay now, you will pay later. But the interest that you have to pay doesn't go away. You have to pay that accumulated interest now. Now, what's changed now? Really very little. You cannot suddenly produce all this money when you have really had almost no earnings, and since then your earnings have been limping back to a fraction of what they were. So to demand all this, we are going to see many, many more of these things go bust. They probably are going bust already, but we're not getting sufficient data on that. The microfinance sector in general is apparently in deep crisis, which is being papered over by NABARD and others who have an interest in saying that it's not as severe as it is. But that in turn translates into real difficulties for women's cooperatives and women's self-help groups that were trying to engage in productive activities in this period. So what do we ask for? In terms of the revenue generation, let's begin with that. Just like the budget does usually, the most obvious thing is to massively reduce the regressive element of the taxation. And that can be done without adverse revenue implications if we simply do a few basic measures that some of us have been arguing for a very long time, and all of us have been arguing for. The most obvious is a wealth tax. And of course, there are many different opinions about how much wealth should be taxed and so on. But supposing we go for really just the tax on the richest individuals, okay, very, very high bar, so that people don't think, oh, I'm a middle class person who has a house and that's going to be taxed very highly, etc. No. Remember, we already have a property tax, which is a form of wealth tax, and nobody really objects to that. But what I'm suggesting is a tax on the known wealth of relatively small number of very, very high net worth individuals, okay? So Subramaniam, the former MIDS professor, many of you know him, he did a calculation before the pandemic. In fact, in 2019, early 2019, he did a calculation of what happens if you put a 4% tax on the wealth of just the Forbes richest billionaires, 965 families. That's all, just 965 families. A 4% tax would, at that time in 2019, he estimated, would generate 1% of GDP. Just that, okay? 1% of GDP is our entire public health spending, center and states put together. It would double our public health spending. Now, 4% of a tax on, billions means that the billionaire holding it will not really notice. I mean that. I mean, I really, you know, this kind of reduction in income happens to you anyway when stock markets move or something like that, right? So it's no big deal. It's no biggie to do that. And many countries have a much higher rate of wealth tax, actually, over a much larger range of wealthy. We know that since Subramaniam did that estimate, the wealth of the richest, according to both Forbes and Credit Suisse, the wealth of the richest in India has doubled or more than doubled. Yeah, I mean, the double A's in our country have expanded their wealth. I think the Adani fortune has gone up by 5 times. The Ambani fortune has gone up only double, but he started from a much higher base, right? So, you know, we could do that really quite easily if we had the political will. And, you know, it's only if you keep making that demand, that you get something approaching the noise that is required to make governments respond to that demand. So the wealth tax is, as I said, really low-hanging fruit for us to avail of. And the other low-hanging fruit is the taxing of multinationals, on which actually the Indian government has been slightly better than a bunch of other governments, but hasn't gone far enough and is obviously susceptible to external pressure quite easily on this matter. Now, what needs to be done here? Essentially, the fact is that what happens with multinational companies is that they end up paying much lower rates of tax than domestic companies. In fact, they often end up paying no tax. Why? Because they shift all their profits to low tax jurisdictions, the phenomenon that is called base erosion and profit shifting. And they do this by claiming that, you know, they have to pay royalties, technical fees, etc., to their other subsidiaries. Ireland is a very favorite subsidiary, but New Hampshire and which is the state that Biden is from? These are tax haven states also, right? What do? They say, well, you know, our sales, Facebook, for example, the sales in India amount to 12% of its revenues, okay? But officially, profits made in India are only 4%, or less than that, 2.4%, I'm sorry. I could go on and on. I mean, basically all the multinationals do this, right? And then they shift the money to low tax jurisdictions. And some countries have a really sort of convenient way of getting around the problem. They offer companies a convenient way. Ireland offers what has often been called the double Dutch Irish sandwich. So you claim that your profits are all in Ireland, and then Ireland has a double taxation treaty with the Netherlands. So if you say that, well, actually some of that is generated in the Netherlands and you will be paying a tax there, then you end up paying zero tax, even in Ireland. And then the Netherlands, you can do another tax fiddle, which means you don't pay much tax in the Netherlands either. This is then you can say, okay, well, how can we stop that? These are multinationals, they can go around the world doing what they want. The solution is actually quite simple, and it's a solution that has been put forward, of course, by a commission that I'm part of, the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation, but also by the group of 24 developing countries in the Bretton Woods institutions. And it's been put into the OECD tax negotiations, which unfortunately at the moment have ended with a whimper. But what's the plan? That you treat Apple or Google or Amazon or any multinational company as one global company, not as Amazon India, Amazon France, Amazon US, Amazon Canada. No, Amazon is one company globally. It has one set of global profits. And that's, by the way, how the shareholders see it, okay? And we will demand our share of their global profits to be taxable according to a formula based on sales, employment, assets. Why employment and assets? Because a lot of developing countries are producers rather than consumers, naturally, right? We are the poorer countries, so our markets are smaller. So we should incorporate those in a formula, let's say 60, 20, 20%, whatever, you know, some ratio. If we do that, then every country simply says, well, all right, Amazon, you say that your taxable profits in India are only 100 million. But in fact, according to this formula, your global profits are so many billion, and my share of that is 500 million, not 100 million. So I'm going to tax you at my domestic tax rate, 24% at the moment. I'm going to tax you at that. The same as I tax my domestic companies who cannot do all this base erosion and profit shifting. Now, if we did that, we would actually get a significant increase in tax revenues. It's true that it's harder for developing countries to do this on their own. A group of developing countries together could do it, but India is large enough to do it on its own if it wants. India can actually, and if it did threaten to do that, it would also force the hand of other countries in the negotiations to get this moving forward. So in terms of revenue raising, we really have to move away from aggressive taxation to, and especially the tax on the fuels, which have gone up disproportionately in the recent past, and focus on a tax on the rich and on large companies that are paying less than domestic companies in the profits, in the corporate taxes. In terms of expenditure, I mean, it's again obvious from everything I've said. We need a massive increase in spending on food, and we need to diversify the kinds of food that are provided in the public distribution system. We already have surplus food stocks, which obscenely grew during the pandemic, the food stocks. From 77 million went up to 120 million, came down to 98 million, but the point is much higher than they were pre-pandemic. We now have more food grain. We should be distributing a lot more as free food, and we should be adding many more elements to the public distribution system to enable a more rounded and balanced diet, which has really taken a battering during this period. And we need to, oh, I've gone on for far too long, have I? No, I still have some time, okay. And we need to ensure that the systems that enable the young to get nutrition, midday meals, the ICDS and so on, are up and running as soon as possible and providing cooked meals as soon as possible. I think that's absolutely essential. And it's true, people will say that's a state government thing, but it needs central support, which it has not got so far. We obviously need a very significant increase in the rural employment program. It is massively underfunded. We now know that, well, I mean, I'm part of a group, the People's Action for Employment Guarantee. We just recently did a study that shows that, you know, they've already spent more than 90% of the money for the whole financial year. And they have to actually spend more just to keep the program running. 23 states are in deficit already and don't have any more money to spend. And you know what happens when that they basically stop the program, because they put the money out on their own and then the center doesn't repay, and it goes on like that. So there has to be additional budgetary allocation this year, right now. And it can be done under supplementary grants. It's been done before. So we have to make that demand for immediate additional spending on NREGA. And we have to ensure that it's not every year that that program is left in arrears. Every year, about 25% of the spending just goes into paying arrears for the previous year. That has to stop. We have to be making sure the center does what the law ensures, that it provides the money as per demand. 5 chief ministers have written, I think 7 now, including from some BJP ruled states, saying we must have more money for NREG. So it has to happen this year, well before the budget. It has to be a major additional expenditure. This is not a question of being nice and being good and being generous. The central government often claims that we have made the largest ever allocation and all this. The NREG is a demand-driven scheme by law. The government is duty bound to provide the resources. And when it doesn't, it is actually going against the law. The Supreme Court has already made this point to the central government. It's already hauled up the government for leaving states in arrears. So, you know, there's really no excuse for not dramatically increasing the spending. And we know, again, in this one, that this is a scheme that disproportionately employs women, disproportionately in the sense that it's more than the 30% reserved for women. Typically, in some states, it has gone above 50%. And that's a good thing, because that's one of the few places where the gender gap is supposedly non-existent, but anyway, significantly lower. No-brainer, we need dramatic increase in the ICDS, not just to make it up and running, but a very, very dramatic increase. We also need a very significant increase in the school education, and particularly the primary school education that has been, as I've already told you, has been experiencing such a massive shock that we're going to have children with learning deficiencies now for several years, unless we do this on an emergency basis. Higher education, what can I say? You know, I was, my last semester in JNU, I was teaching an online course because, you know, the pandemic struck and everything. Half of the semester became online. I had a compulsory class with 92 students, 40 of whom could never access a single online lecture, not one, because they just didn't have the connectivity. And, you know, Zoom lectures are very data heavy. So even many were in distant parts or even in the cities. I mean, JNU itself has terrible connectivity half the time. So they simply could not access it. They couldn't even listen to it later because it's so data heavy and data is expensive. So what are we talking about, you know? If we have to prepare for a situation of hybrid learning, which is apparently what JNU is planning to do, we have to make sure every student has got access. And there is none of that. There is none of the planning and connectivity, you know, infrastructure investment, or any of the things that are absolutely essential for doing even this. You know, unfortunately, it's never as good online, right? But you cannot do it if people are not connected. It doesn't work. To pretend that you're doing online and then not to give people access is an absolute crime. And that is what's been happening in India. So again, you need massive resources to ensure this, even minimally, in case of any future requirements when suddenly you would have to do this kind of online learning. And of course, you need much more spending just to ensure that all of that backlog that has happened in higher education is met somehow and is dealt with. So significant increases, including hiring new people, of course, filling all the vacancies. Massive vacancies still exist in both central and state governments, have to be filled. And in fact, the positions have to be expanded. All of this requires huge funding, okay? We have to also be, I think, prepared for more, what shall I say, shocks, more disasters. And that's where our response to disasters has been appalling. Okay, the National Disaster Management Act, which is a very centralizing act, was used to impose the national lockdown. So it was a very centralizing way lockdown. As you know, state governments were not informed, other ministries were not informed, nobody knew except for the PMO apparently. But it was also then, having imposed a very central lockdown, you then left the states to fend on their own. You did not provide the required resources that were necessary. We all know that PM Cares has been this scandal, really, whereby money has been collected and now we're told it's a private fund and we have no knowledge of where that money has gone and what it's being used for. But state governments who have been desperate for funds have been denied this. The relief for disasters has been provided on very politically motivated grounds. It's been delayed, denied, and reduced for major natural disasters like the floods in Kerala, the cyclones in West Bengal, etc., in states that have been run by opposition parties, essentially. We need to demand a much more flexible and generous approach to demand management, because let's face it, you know, climate change is upon us. It's no longer in the future. We're going to need more and more funds for climate adaptation. These disasters are not going away. They are happening as we speak. Right now, there are massive floods in Tamil Nadu. What are we going to do about ensuring that there is a central response to these? So we must demand much greater flexibility. And of course, then in disaster relief, there are many, many gender issues that come up. I think all of you are familiar with it. I'm not going to elaborate, but so far, our approach to disaster management and the funds allocated for disaster management have not been particularly gender sensitive. And they've relied very much on land titles, on who's the head of household, on all the male breadwinner kinds of things. We need to get away from that towards a much more people-centered, feminist approach to disaster management as well. But above all, we need much more funding, much more flexibility in funding, and much more norm-based funding that doesn't depend on the political proclivities of the central and state governments. So these are some of the things. I mean, there are many, many more things I know all of you will think of. These are some of the things that we should be asking for. I see that there are lots of questions in the chat, which I will try and look at, but let me stop here and we can have a discussion. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Jayati. This was really something that we were looking forward to, laying out all the issues in front of us, the things that we are planning to discuss over the next 2 days of the consultation. I mean, you exactly know what we do in this process. You have been our supporter and friend from the inception. Thanks so much for this great talk. I think we have a lot of questions. I think 2 questions on GST, basically, that we have. Maybe, and one of the questions, I think 2 more questions on taxation. So can you see your chat box on the questions? Yes. You are muted.
Yeah, because why did you
I'm sorry. Okay, right.
Okay.
So I think the first question is from Aishwarya about incorporating fuel tax within the GST. And I think somebody else has also talked about fuel taxes.
Yes.
So yeah, you know, this is the thing that for obvious reasons, fuel taxes were not put in the GST because the center likes to use it, the state governments like to use it, right? And if they were put in GST, that would put an absolute limit on what they can extract from it, which would really mess up the central government's revenue management. I think there's a very strong case for it. I don't think it's going to happen because even the state governments don't particularly want it right now. And the center definitely doesn't want it. So we can demand it. I don't think it would happen. The point, though, is absolutely correct that, you know, this whole, a lot of people say, but, you know, we should have high fuel taxes because we want to move away from carbon and all that. But it doesn't work that way because the carbon, we're still incentivizing carbon investments, right? The government is still giving all these subsidies for coal. It's still offering you know, lots of natural gas and petroleum resources on the cheap. So the government is incentivizing carbon emitting fuel investments anyway. So the idea that the carbon price in India will make a difference, that's not correct, because in India there are different elements at work. What's happening is that the fuel tax, which enters into every other price because it enters into transport, it enters into agricultural costs, it enters every other price. And that's being used as the major cash cow, if you like, the major source of revenue raising. That really has to stop. So I think, yes, we should make that demand, that bring it into the GST and tax it at, okay, the highest rate if you like, but keep it there. Do not, at the moment, fuel taxes account in most states for about 60 to 70% of the price, which is ridiculous and obscene. Okay, so yeah, absolutely. Ravi, hi Ravi, nice to see you here, or not see you, but know you are here. Revenues forgone. What about putting an end to tax expenditures for the corporate sector? Absolutely. Thank you for raising that. You know, this whole thing about revenues forgone, it was earlier part of what is seen as industrial policy. That is to say that you are thinking of subsidizing particular sectors as a means of ensuring, you know, as a strategic thing, you want to promote particular sectors. Over time, it's really become a way of rewarding special interests. And, you know, these small changes in duty, these small changes in this and that, Reliance Industries in the father Ambani's time was the past master of doing this. a tiny change in an excise duty rate that nobody would notice, or in an import duty rate that was lost in the details of the budget documents, would end up giving him massive profits and undercutting rivals like Bombay Dyeing and all of that in those days. So this is not a new thing. But essentially the revenues foregone has become a means for crony capitalism and special interests rather than industrial policy. And it's huge. Okay, the estimates on average, I mean, I last did a calculation way back in 2018, but I'm sure Shona, Malini, and all of you know better than me. Between 5 to 7% of GDP, right? So larger than the fiscal deficit is the revenues foregone every year, which is ridiculous. And it clearly is not contributing to any industrial policy because, hey, where is our industrial policy? Where is our industrialization? Where is any of this, right? So clearly the way in which we're using revenues foregone is all wrong. And it reflects lobbying, political, economic power, crony capitalism, rather than any genuine industrial policy.
One more question on wealth tax, examples of wealth tax covering social security in any countries.
Right. Yes, thank you. Okay, so here's the thing. When you do a tax on wealth, it goes into the broad overall resources, right, which are fungible. So you can't say wealth tax funds social security, and we should get out of that trap. This is a trap that neoliberals always put to you. They say, you can't spend on this. Where's the money? Show me the money. I regret to say our former Prime Minister, Mr. Manmohan Singh, used to always say this as well. I remember when in the National Knowledge Commission, I got finally the rest of the commission to agree to the demand for right to education, which at that time was not a law. And so we wrote this letter and he tells me in a meeting, where's the money? Find me the money, which is ridiculous. Why should particular types of social spending be asked to find the money? Do they say the same when they give a tax rebate? Do they say, well, the money for the tax rebate is going to come from X, Y? No, they don't. So this whole argument that this much spending has to be done by this much taxation, as if they're all separate pots. We have to drop that idea. We have to tell them that we don't buy it and we're not fooled by it. Having said that, there are a number of developing countries that have wealth taxes with varying degrees of efficiency. Okay, let me be clear. Across Asia, there are wealth taxes which are, and they range in terms of where the cutoff point is for the wealth and how much tax there is. Okay, but on average, most countries, the wealth taxes go from about 2 to 10%. But remember, a property tax is also a wealth tax. Okay, and everybody accepts the property tax hoga. It's no kind of big surprise. When it comes to financial wealth, suddenly everybody gets cold feet. Why? We have Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia, all kinds of countries have got wealth taxes. And financial wealth is rather easy to calculate. It's true, you don't know a lot of the other wealth that they've got. You don't know what they've salted away in the Bahamas or in the Cayman Islands, or what they've got in gold, or what they've got in famous paintings. And we don't know all of that, but you do know a significant amount of the financial wealth. And it's relatively easy to tax that. It's actually easier than calculating the property taxes. So as I said, I'm not even saying that you tax, even let's say millionaires. I'm saying let's just go for the billionaires. Let's just go for the billionaires and do a very small tax. The dollar billionaires and do a really small tax. That's already going to generate, as I said, 1% of GDP, maybe 1.5% of GDP. And there are countries that do it. In India, the wealth tax we had was, first of all, on a very low base. So it covered a lot of people. It was a very, very low rate. And it wasn't implemented efficiently. So people kept saying, well, the costs of implementing are higher than what you're getting from it. That's because of the way it was designed and structured. We can design a tax which is relatively low on a very high base. And then it's easier to implement. Then you're only dealing with maybe 1,000 individuals. It's not such a biggie. Okay.
There are quite a few questions, but before we get into that, just to come back to this entire issue about including gender within this process of recovery, I was just thinking that, and this is sorry about everybody, I just wanted her to wanted the focus to be a little on one of the important things that we would also be discussing. Is given you talked a lot about the implications on education learnings of children who have been out of school for 2 years. But I think there is also this entire issue about women staying at home, having to take care of children, more men in the house, and also the implications of more men staying at men staying more hours in the house, impact on violence against women. So, if you could just bring those perspectives into the discussion.
Yes. No, you're absolutely right. And I'm really sorry that I had this point about the unpaid work and I left it out of the discussion. Thank you for bringing that up, because we all know this, that the pandemic also meant a dramatic increase in unpaid work. First, because children are not going to school. Second, because all the available public care facilities, as limited as they are, were closed. So whether it is hospital care or any other kind of care, you could not access any of that. And third, because all of the other avenues in which various kinds of extended care could be delegated also did not exist. So much more unpaid work within the home. And we all know that the distribution of that was not particularly ideal within homes, right? That the gender distribution of that remained as awful as it has been in our societies. And we also know that that male frustration typically expresses itself in domestic violence. And the very limited evidence we have, because it's also harder even to report domestic violence when you're stuck at home with the perpetrator, that there was a significant increase in domestic violence. And of course, all the avenues for dealing with that were also largely closed, like shelters for women and all of that kind of thing. So the pandemic has meant that this sort of triple whammy, if you like, for women, loss of access to paid employment, much more requirement of unpaid care work at home, and facing domestic violence, including from frustrated male members of the household. So additional violence at home, all of these disproportionately affected women, which in turn, if you look at the budgetary implications, means that you have to be spending more on precisely these things, on much more enabling of care activities, including home-based delivery of care. This is something that the Kerala government has been rather good at pioneering, especially for the elderly and those requiring, special, those with disabilities and so on, home-based care deliveries. But also we need much more budget allocation for women's protection. This is something that successive governments have been dreadful on, okay? The famous Nirbhaya fund, which never even got spent. It was pathetically low to begin with, but it was never spent. And I think we need much more in terms of the allocation in different ways for protecting women from violence as well, in addition to the things that would reduce their domestic care burden. Okay, there are many more questions. Okay, I think.
Thank you so much. We just have 5 minutes more to the session. It is up to you how you want to conclude it, Jayati.
Okay, well, I see that there's a question on NREGA, which I would briefly touch on. And then there's a question about allocating a certain proportion of the entire budget for gender justice. So here's the thing. In terms of the NREGA, this whole idea that there is this one pot of money that the government has and it can only spend that pot, and the NREGA pot is only this 70,000 crore and it can't spend more than that, is nonsense. Okay, all governments spend before they get the revenues. They get the revenues at the end of March, they're spending over the year. Okay, so this idea that there's only a given amount of money, that's completely untrue. They can spend if they want, and the law in the NREGA says you have to spend. You cannot say, oh, I don't have the money. There is no such constraint. It's entirely notional, this idea that there is a constraint that prevents the money from being spent by the central government. And the central government has been saying, oh, I can't do this without an ordinance. We can't spend this money because, we need parliament session. Again, it's nonsense. You can spend and then make a supplementary demand for grant because the law says you have to spend when there is a demand for this. So the fact that a state goes into a deficit over this is already illegal. We also know now that a huge amount of the delays in wage payments is because the central government doesn't transfer the money for the wages. So, the central government has no excuse on this. There is no question that, oh, we don't have money, we don't have funds. All of that is actually irrelevant. And it is what it's doing is, strictly speaking, illegal. Even the Supreme Court has said that in terms of the money for NREGA. Overall, do we need to say allocate so much for gender justice? So here's the thing, we've all been advocates of gender budgeting, but let's face it, it's become a con. The way it is utilized, especially by the government of India, it's a con. What do? They say 10% of the budget is going to women and to gender. And that's, what do? They take some scheme and they transfer it to that head and they say, ab ye gender justice wala ho gaya. That's not what we want. What we want is specific action. We want specific spending. So let's not fall for that con where they can just do a little bit of fiddling of budgetary heads and come and tell you, we're spending 30% on gender, you should be happy. Let's not fall for that. Let's say, these are the things we want. Here are the specifics. And you better deliver on those specifics, because if you don't, then you're not doing anything for gender justice. So yeah, that whole 10%, 15%, 20%, that's what they would love, because that really lets them off the hook. They can always do a fiddle, an accounting thing, and tell you that, yeah, we're doing so much for gender justice. You should really be celebrating us. We should be demanding this much money for, this scheme, for that program, for that spending, and so on. And don't raise money in this way, raise it in this other way. Those are the things that we should be demanding. I think that's about it. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Due to paucity of time, we apologize. Probably we won't be able to take all the questions now. But here we are all gathered in this hybrid mode. We don't know how to operate, but we all want to say a hi to you who have gathered in IBIJ office. So we have with us Jashodhara, Ritu, Sunita, Renu, and Nilangi. So, and Nisar, and my colleague Kanika. So yes, hello to all.
Lovely to see you all, and lucky you to be all together.
Yes.
Hi Ritu, hi everyone. Hi.
Okay, thank you so much. And I think we can conclude and wrap up the session. Thanks to the audience and thanks to the speaker, of course. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay, please be with us, audience. We are just going to take a 5-minute break and come back for the next first technical session of the day at 12 sharp. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Some people have their hands up. Huh?
Already?
They had it earlier also.
No.
Hi everyone.
Am I audible?
Very nice to see Ravi.
Okay. We've had this stellar keynote speech by Professor Jayati Ghosh, and she was already with us, and so we apologize. We began just a few minutes ahead of schedule. But before we start the next session, I'd just like to say a few words about who we are and why we are organizing this event. So those of us here are part of a voluntary network, which is called the Feminist Policy Collective. And we are working on transformative policy and financing towards gender justice. We include feminist organizations, individual researchers, academicians, policy advocates, and women's groups. And we are really committed to bringing about this transformation in policies, plans, and budgets in India. So this particular consultation that we are calling Envisioning a Feminist Policy Response to the COVID-19 Pandemic, this consultation is really meant to provide some recommendations to the government as they are preparing for the annual Union Budget 2022-23. And we feel that it's really important for all the relief measures, the policies and budgets to use a gender lens and to account for the intersectional and other vulnerabilities that are faced by women and girls in the current context. So this is meant to be a really wide-ranging consultation. हमारे साथ बहुत साथी हैं जो अलग-अलग प्रांतों से आए हैं और बहुत साथी हैं जो अलग-अलग आंदोलन और संगठन से आए हैं. उन सभी साथियों को जिंदाबाद. फेमिनिस्ट पॉलिसी कलेक्टिव जो है वो एक ऐसा मंच है जिसमें हम लोग एक स्वैच्छिक रूप से जुड़े हैं ताकि जेंडर समानता की ओर हम कुछ ऐसे बहुत ही जिसको हम कह रहे हैं कि ट्रांसफॉर्मेटिव पॉलिसी, बहुत ही बदल देने वाली कुछ ऐसी नीतियां, कुछ ऐसे बजट को लेकर के हम लोग अपने प्रस्ताव रखना चाहते हैं और सरकार से इन मांगों को रखना चाहते हैं जो कि जेंडर समानता और जेंडर न्याय की ओर बढ़ सकता है. तो सभी साथियों को जिंदाबाद. और बहुत संगठनों के बहुत सारे प्रतिनिधि हमारे अलग अलग सत्रों में बोलेंगे. इसके लिए हम पहले से ही उनका बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया अदा करते हैं और उम्मीद करते हैं कि जब भी आपको जरूरत होगी, अगर अनुवाद चाहिए होगा तो जरूर कहिएगा ताकि हम हिंदी में उसका सारांश दे सके. Friends, in English, if you need any translation from what is being shared in Hindi, please do ask for it in the chat box and we will do our best to provide summary translations. So thank you. And with that, we should start our next session. So the next session is really looking at the overall fiscal policy scenario in the post-COVID era in some more detail. And I'm very, very pleased to welcome our three panelists, Dr. Ritu Diwan, Ravi Duggal, and Malini Chakravarti. I'm sure many of them are known to you, but just to give a very, very brief introduction, Professor Ritu Diwan is one of the founder and co-conveners of the Feminist Policy Collective. She is the Vice President of the Indian Society for Labor Economics and the Vice President of the Indian Society for Agricultural Economics. She's also a former president of the Indian Association for Women's Studies. And until her retirement, she was the first ever woman director of the Department of Economics at the University of Mumbai and the founder member of the first Center for Gender Economics in Asia. Ravi Duggal, welcome Ravi, our old comrade. Ravi is presently an independent researcher who has been involved with research on health services, health economics, primary healthcare systems, health policy and budgets, human rights, and the right to healthcare. He has formerly been with the International Budget Partnership and Sehat Mumbai, and he's also associated actively with the People's Health Movement, the Jan Swasthya Abhiyan in India, the Medico Friends Circle, and the People's Budget Initiative. Malini Chakravarti, welcome Malini. Malini is thematic lead at the Center for Budget and Governance Accountability, CBGA, the thematic lead for research on tax equity, and has worked extensively on issues of domestic taxation and their inequalizing impact, such as the GST introduced recently. She has more than 20 years of research experience within and out of CBGA. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Ritu Diwan to conduct this session.
Thank you, Jashida, very much for the introduction and for the context setting in the way of what we really plan to do in this session. I think the session really has been conceived that whatever our demands are in the budget or whatever they're going to be in the budget has to be located within, I think, a perspective of what has happened in the last year and a half since the pandemic, what have been the effects. And therefore, I think before, I'll just talk for a few minutes and lay that kind of a context, and then we will have Malini and Ravi, and then of course our question answer session at the end of it. Now, we all know that the pandemic, when it came, Indian economy was already in a very, very desperate situation. Our GDP was very low. The growth rate was very low. We had, I think, a hugely declining work participation rate, particularly where women are concerned. The gender wage gap by official data had actually increased during this entire period. Now, remember, this is a pre-pandemic that we are talking about. So what happens after this is much, much worse. And this is all recorded official data. Industrial capacity at 40% in spite of all the wonderful tax bonanzas, etc., which were given. I think recording the highest asset inequality and income inequality, both of them at this particular point of time. A decrease in consumption expenditure, that was again for the first time in many, many years. The lowest, we already had in India, the lowest monthly minimum wage at, I think, 4,300 rupees per month in all of South Asia. So the poverty levels actually for the first time in 42 years actually increased. The percentage of people below the poverty line actually increased. And this is something which had never happened before. And fall in every single global ranking, whether we talk about Global Hunger Index, of course, again, we have fallen 4 or 5 places in this past 1 year, but whether it was pollution or you just take it at everything, press freedom, education, gender wage gap, employment, every single, I think 13 or 14 indicators which were there is exactly where we had already fallen. And then comes the pandemic in this context. And, you know, we say the impact of the pandemic, but for me, it's much more the impact of the policy response of the pandemic, which has really caused all the major issues which we are debating today and which we will be discussing today, and which will translate into some kind of budget demands and asks at a broader level. Women, of course, transgenders, and of course, all the categories which are there. So you have this policy response, which it's the most uncaring, the most discompassionate, no compassion at all in terms of what was put forward, whether it was the relief package or the budget. Very unethical, economically totally wrong in terms of whether it was efficiency or equality, and absolutely divorced from the lived reality of the majority of people in our country, men and women. And I think the images of the migrants walking home is something which is going to haunt us for generations. I hope it's going to haunt us. It doesn't haunt the present, the leadership, etc. And within this, you get a budget, okay, which was called the never before budget, and which I have been writing on, and which I term as the never again budget. It was totally separate from what total disconnect between what was needed by the people and what was actually given. So instead of a demand-oriented budget, you had a totally supply-oriented, the focus on credit. I'm not going to the details of it because you're just laying out the broad issues within which our budget demands will come forward. So you had it credit-based, the gender budget was reduced by 26%. Narega, we know what has happened. We've been demanding for a very long period of time, I think for 5 or at least 6 years, for an urban employment program. Absolutely no context or mention of that. No support at all to the MSMEs, where a large number of women are employed, or the large number of the poor are employed, or to SHGs. I think that's another area which we really need to focus on when we ask for our demands. Your ICDS is stopped, your education system, etc., and no data. I mean, we kept asking for data and nothing, actually nothing. I really think data in India has become like urban luxury. If it opposes any kind of official statement, lock it up, put it in jail, don't give any bail and don't file any cases, but don't release the data. And this is something which is very, very problematic, where when you make calculations for what you want during a budget or what you're going to give during a budget becomes very, very basic. And in this, I would like to just mention the issue, what was mentioned in that Never Again budget was the need and the demand for data, was the need for a migrant portal. And absolutely nothing was done. Went to court over a period of time. Sorry?
Speak into the mic, they can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. So, I hope I don't have to repeat everything. Yeah, because anyway, so the need for a migrant portal, which was not done. Some of us went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court finally gave an order that please do the migrant portal. It was set up only last month. Of course, highly digitalized, and in the context of, I think, the existing literacy levels, I mean, forget about the digital literacy levels, is something which is very, very difficult to be able to fill in. But also, I think the huge number of card conditionalities that seems, this card culture that you have to have an Aadhaar, you have to have all your other records which are there, particularly when migrants are concerned, even to be able to access that pathetic 5 kilos of wheat or rice, which was to be what was given as a largesse. That itself became a major issue. We did try in some areas, those who were working with the migrants, in particular, that please remove the card conditionality. And I'm very happy to say, at least in parts of Maharashtra, we were able to do that, and just give food to those who need it. Please do not insist on a particular card or, or a collection of cards to be showed before you're given that bit of food. Also, I think all this combined, and if you see the budget of last year, a huge reduction in subsidies. And the subsidies, food subsidies, there was an actual reduction in food subsidies. If you see the CAG data, which is there, a reduction in education, not only allocations, but also subsidies. And of course, you had the withdrawal and then a reintroduction for a period of 2 or 3 months of Ujjwala, of the gas scheme. And also an extension of the DBTK, that is your direct benefit transfer for kerosene. And during the pandemic, every kerosene dealer was allowed to increase the price of kerosene by 25 paisa a fortnight, which means a lot when you're earning very little or now not earning anything at all. So the huge increase in unpaid work, I think, which becomes a very major issue which we need to address in terms of particularly the budget and the asks in terms of revenue raising and also in terms of the allocations which exist. The scheme designs, which also are very problematic, is something which we have to look at. So there was this 1,500 rupees promised to widows and disabled women in some particular areas over 3 months. And the appeal which some of us made was that please don't divide that 1,500 rupees into 500 per month for 3 months. Give it at one go, because with all the transport stop, that woman to access that 500 rupees a month had to spend an average of 140 or 150 rupees. So what she got was barely 2/3 of that pathetic amount of 500 rupees. So I think our asks also have to focus on the design of the schemes, the new schemes or the earlier schemes which we are putting forward. The budget issues, of course, there are many which are long-term. These are not short-term, certainly not short-term. When you talk about education in particular, Jayati's mentioned a few, and already advertisements have started coming out for jobs, for the little amount of jobs, where they say very clearly that those who have passed or got their degrees in 2020 and 2021 need not apply. So it's a huge, I think, a comment on what was really done where education was concerned. There's a lot of other data on long-term issues which are there. Domestic violence, of course. So now, in fact, UN has given a separate name for it. It's called the shadow pandemic, because domestic violence has increased so hugely. Also, age at marriage. This is very particular and very specific to India, that the age at marriage has actually fallen in these years. And there are many records in many states. Of course, no data is available at the central level of the increase in child marriages up to 9 and 12 and 13 at many levels. Also, if we see the last budget and the utilization levels, and this is very inexplicable. I mean, we know the huge increase in domestic violence has been reported across the board in many states. Yet last year, in the last FY, we had 74% of the Nirbhaya fund, which itself is so minimal, transferred to the Ministry of Home Affairs. I mean, there was no explanation which was given for this. Almost 80% of the Nirbhaya fund under the UP government, the Uttar Pradesh government, remained unspent, in spite of the fact is that cases of violence against women are the maximum in that state. So this broader scenario, and along with that, you have many other issues. I'm not getting into them, I'm just listing them out. Diversion of funds or withdrawing of funds from developmental funding into COVID and various other kinds of issues. GST allocation to states, which has not been done, and which is really a constitutional issue, because the constitution makes the GST sharing between the center and the state extremely clear. Under the camouflage of COVID, we've had the labor codes, the farm acts, which impact women hugely, the Forest Rights Act changes, the Environmental Act changes, the attack on common property resources, now the issue of monetization and privatization, of course, and this, I think the macro policy is something we need to take into account, is the non-inflation targeting. Our inflation rate is 12%, 12 to 12.5%, and partly fuel and partly many other reasons. And in the middle of this situation, the Reserve Bank of India actually buys dollars when it is at the highest rate of 75 rupees. You know, so when we say we have no money to allocate, I do not believe in this, because the way we have wasted money on buying dollars at 75, the way the money is being spent, I think it's a minimum of 64,000 crores on the central vista. So the rebuilding of the parliaments, etc., to have better vastu. There are many ways in which the money has just been spent. And of course, the fact that we are very clear that fiscal deficit is not the main issue at debate these days. So there has been overall what I call, when we talk about the macroeconomic framework, the macroeconomic framework also takes into account, or the paradigm also takes into account scientific temper. It takes into account equitable technology. It takes into account, rationality, economic rationality, apart from the issues of efficiency. And therefore, when we make our demands, we also have to see it in the broader context of what is the nature of the demands which we are making in the context of the nature of the state. I think that is something which is very essential and related to the attainment. Because one thing is very clear, what has been happening over the last year or so is that all dates of attainment of our SDGs, of our sustainable development goals, will surely be postponed, and they have been postponed, including something like child marriage, thing which is very, I mean, I think the worst form in a way of what has been happening to women. So our demands in the context of a state which does not care about development, which focuses only on growth and growth of a few, which from a weak enabler has actually become a de-enabler. And you know, and that the fact that the present state, whether it's a, you know, what I call a macro patriarchal state, that it cannot exist unless it increases, particularly this form of the state, cannot exist unless it increases all forms of inequality, whether they're economic or extra-economic. So I think when we make our demands, we put it within this broader framework. There's a lot more to say, but of course we'll say it during the discussion. I now ask Malini to make a presentation. She will be focusing on the revenue raising component and the issues of, I think, gender justice via taxation. So what we call gender tax justice on the revenue aspect of it. And then after that, Ravi, on the focus of budget transparency. I think this is something which is very, very important in terms not only of the last budget, but in terms of the overall fact that India has now been downgraded from a democracy to a flawed democracy. So I request Malini to please present.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. I'll just
So,
I hope this is visible.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. I'm extremely honored to be part of this FPC pre-budget consultation. This is the first time that I'm attending this. Now, you know, Professor Jayati Ghosh being the first speaker always puts others in a disadvantageous position. So a lot of things that she has already mentioned, I'll be covering in a little more detail. She did mention that, you know, a lot of these things that we're talking about are something that we have been discussing over the last 2 years. The reason why, I mean, that of course is one reason that it might seem like a repetition. But another reason why it is somewhat of a repetition when we focus on the revenue generation aspect of the government is because the fiscal policy itself today is in a bind, in the sense that the maneuverability that the government has, it has actually reduced its maneuverability in terms of how to, the kind of fiscal policy, and in particular, the revenue generation aspect. So we know, you know, I'm not going into the context of what exactly happened during the pandemic. The only thing was that there was, of course, a need for a very bold fiscal policy. Now, India, as Jayati mentioned, you know, turned out to be extraordinarily different from other countries in terms of actually not following. So now, what it meant, therefore, is that it really didn't want to get into a, take on a huge fiscal deficit. So what this means is that what it can generate in terms of revenue is largely going to determine how much it can spend and on what. So in terms of revenue generation, therefore, the amount of tax revenue is one aspect, which is of course very important in terms of how much is going to be spent on various sectors and sectors which are particularly important for women's or gender equality. But there's also another aspect, which again, Jayati, they had covered, but I'll cover in greater detail, is what is the composition of tax revenue generated? Because that by itself has implications on the amount generated as well as inequality, independent of what the pandemic did. Now, if you look at what has been happening in terms of total revenue generated, how it has been affected over time, and even before the pandemic, a number of tax policy measures have ensured that we actually lose out on revenue generation. So if you look at the trend of tax collection, say for the last few years, from 14-15, you'd see that they had actually been increasing till we reached 1920, when there's actually a nominal fall in tax collection. In fact, as far as I remember, this is the first time there's a nominal fall. So it's not just in terms of GDP, there's actually a nominal fall. So the fall in revenue generation, which of course impacts spending, happened before the COVID. And of course, we know the reason. In terms of GDP, it translated into quite a large fall. So till about, let's say, tax to GDP ratio, which in any case in India is pretty poor, it was at least increasing. Because in 2019-20, you see a sudden drop. What is the reason? Of course, the sharp cut in corporate tax rates. So the basically cut in tax rates on profits is what was driving it. Now, the interesting aspect is that if you look at what it was in 2019-20, and you look at the final and these of 2020-21, that is the first wave of the pandemic, the last fiscal year, you'll see actually the tax revenue generated during the pandemic is higher than what it was done the previous year. And this is an interesting thing, because then that would give an impression that we're actually doing not so badly. Not really. Why? Because again, the devil lies in the detail. And what has been eloquently described and explained by Jayati, basically what happened is you had a sharp increase in tax on petrol and diesel during the pandemic. So what happened, it's as high, when it happened, is as high as 66% when it comes to petrol, 101% when it comes to diesel. So then what happens during the pandemic, anybody, given that there was a major lockdown, complete cessation of economic activities for at least 2 months, one would have expected tax revenue to fall. It did across the sector, except when it comes to excise duty, and these are the taxes on fuel. So therefore, the extent of drop can be seen when you look at what has been the percentage change compared to what it was supposed to be. Now, if you look at it, corporation tax fell by the highest, at the highest rate. And of course, excise duty went up is the only one which showed a positive increase. Now, of course, that has changed our composition of how much we collect from direct tax and indirect taxes. That, which again, of course, is extremely important for gender equality, economic equality. Now, if you look at the chart in front of you, you'd notice even in 2019-20, when you actually had the effect of the cut in corporate tax, even then, in central government's tax revenue collection, direct taxes were still higher than indirect taxes. Now, the point is that, what the center collects. Center actually collects 60% of the total taxes in the country. And majority of the taxes collected by the direct taxes, majority of it comes from the center. So when you have, of course, the cut in corporate tax rates did make an impact. It led to a fall in the share of direct taxes. But once you come to the pandemic year, there's actually a total fall, where you see that the first time, again, this is the first time that you see the share of direct taxes is actually below that of indirect taxes. What does it imply? Look at what's simply in terms of, who is paying for this revenue generation? Who is being taxed? A simple, this thing is what you see is, in any case, there has been a shift from profits to common people's pocket, to the extent that today, corporate tax only provide about 22% of the total revenue generated by the center, and only petro products is now generating a little less than that. So a huge corporate sector, the huge profit that we have seen, an increase in profits that we have seen during the pandemic, they do not really contribute much, whereas the taxes on petrol products is what has become a major source of revenue generation. Obviously, this means that people are paying much more than what they were doing earlier. So if you remember, I said that fiscal policy today is in a bind. And this is something many economists have been saying. This has happened because of changes in tax policy over the years. I mentioned the corporate tax cut, but GST also has played a very important role in it. So now what happened is all these things happened, within very close quarters in terms of time. So GST comes in 2017, corporate tax cut in 2019. By the time the pandemic comes, what is that the government is left with? The government is not interested in increasing fiscal deficit. So the only way left for the government is to actually increase tax on fuel. Why is it the only way, and how does GST matter here? Because if you remember, GST kind of, GST, the way it has been designed, leaves the center as well as the state governments with very little flexibility to impose any tax or change any tax rates on their own. For that to be able to do that, they need to go to the GST Council. So it's not under any of the governments. Let's say they do not have the flexibility. This we had seen even when, when the Kerala floods happened. The Kerala government had wanted to raise tax rates on some items so that they could fund the rehabilitation. It went to the GST Council. It took 1 year for them to be able to get permission to levy such a tax, and it was only for a short time. So therefore, indirect taxes, even the ones which are, let's say, luxury goods, washing machines, dishwashers, ACs, even the government doesn't have the flexibility anymore to actually increase taxes on them without permission from other parts of the government. It has already cut down corporate tax rate, and it has actually increased tax rate on the very rich in terms of personal income tax. So what is left? Among the revenue among the various sources of revenue, the only thing left then is fuel. And that is exactly what it has been doing. And therefore, what it's done is it is itself in a bind. The way the policy measures have taken place is the reason why we are in a situation like this today. The worst thing to happen is to increase taxes on petrol and petroleum products is because it's an universal intermediary. So as we all know, recently we heard some ministers say that tax on petrol really doesn't hurt the poor. It only hurts the 5% of the population because they're the ones who use it for cars and SUVs and all that. Obviously incorrect, because we all know that it doesn't only go for private consumption, for public transport, for carrying goods from one location to another, and of course as input in agricultural production. So any increase in cost of petro products or hike in prices of petro products lead to an all-around increase in prices. And that is exactly what we are seeing today. Even the RBI today is forced to say that the government should actually reduce petrol taxes on petrol. Now, when the taxes on petrol were increased in March and May last year, the very interesting thing was that international oil prices were very low. So now, what has happened that because international prices have been going up and the government has not reduced taxes much except very recently, the inflationary impact has been increasing. Obviously, when you have inflationary impact like this, it hurts the poor the most, and of course, women even more. Now, there's another aspect which happens when you are such kind of, when you're left with only one source from where you can generate revenue, is that it actually does not really increase revenue generation to the extent it is required. And the implications of this are very clear for us to see in terms of the union budget, the latest union budget last year's. For instance, total nominal government expenditure is supposed to increase by less than 1% over what it was during the pandemic, that is 2021 RE. Now, if it's increasing by less than 1% in nominal terms, given the rate of inflation that we have, of course, it means there's a fall in real terms. So no real increase in expenditure can be expected for any sectors. But as Ritudi also pointed out, expenditure is taking place for quite a few useless activities like the Central Vista. So what you have is, therefore, there's a prioritization further away from expenditure that actually affect and can help in reducing gender inequality. Now, so therefore, what this means is that in terms of revenue generation strategy, people today, and the poor and women, are facing a double whammy. Why is it so? Because one can, of course, argue that unless the government raises more revenue, it cannot finance the required expenditure because the government doesn't want to increase fiscal deficit. But when it's financed like this, what it means is basically people are paying from their own pocket for the public provisioning the government is supposed to do. That's exactly what public provision is not supposed to do. It's not supposed to ensure that people have to pay from their pocket, because then it's not very different from what privatization means. But in terms of, there's another implication, what has been happening over the years, a very significant thing, which has implications for how much the states can spend. Because we all know that when it comes to expenditure for all these important schemes that we have been talking about, states take on the major responsibility. Now, if you look at what has been happening in terms of, the amount that is shared with states, a very interesting thing has been happening, that the government, the central government, which has the maximum taxation power to generate from direct taxes, it has been slowly and over time cutting down the amount that is to be shared with states, to the extent that if you look at the graph here, the amount that was to be shared, that is not part of the shareable pool, was about 11%. It's gone up to 23%, which means that even when—
Malini, sorry, can we wrap up in—
Yes, sure. So
thanks.
Coming to what is the way out? Obviously, as Jayati said, alternative progressive financing is the only way forward. Wealth and inheritance tax, a lot of people have been talking about. I would like to focus on another tax, which is really not talked about much, which is long-term capital gains tax. In India, we have a long-term capital gains tax, but it is taxed at much lower rate than income tax. So if you make financial gains, long-term financial gains, you only pay at the rate of 10%. The second aspect of this is that it's a flat tax. So whether you make 2 lakh gain or 2 crore, everybody pays at the 10% rate. What is important is if you need an alternative and transformative financing, wealth inheritance tax, of course, needs to be brought back, but also you need to make long-term capital gains tax more progressive. I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Oh.
Yeah,
thank you so much, Malini, for this. A lot of information which we don't take into account when we talk about gender budgeting and our budgetary asks. We'll share the PPT, of course, later, because I think the richness of information which is there is very central to our debate. Ravi, I'll ask you to come in now, 15 minutes, please. And maybe our session will extend by a few minutes, which I think is all right. I don't think there should be an issue. Ravi?
Yeah, thanks, Ritu. Yeah, I was asked to speak about transparency of budget information and other related data. I'd like to begin with an interesting definition I kind of came across of transparency in the context of integrity. It is from OECD. It says public spending is vulnerable not only to waste and misuse, but also fraud. Sunlight is the best policy. You know, like sunlight. I mean, we sit in sunlight and we get vitamin D. So it says, so transparency is the best policy for preventing corruption and maintaining high standards of integrity in the use of public funds. So given this context and looking at where we are today in terms of the regime that we have, where there are difficult times, I would even say they're dangerous times, because what is happening, especially with data, is the kind of manipulation and tampering we see, which even Jayati referred to. On a very large scale. I mean, we've seen what has happened in employment data and so on. So even with budget data, we see vast reductions in transparency. What we used to get earlier, we no longer get it, or we get it in a form which is tells the story much less. So that's where we are today. So in fact, we see a different kind of situation. We see what I would call reverse transparency. They want more and more of our data, but they don't want to share data of the public system back with us. So this is the scenario. Just to take an example, I mean, recently they started the eShram portal, okay, to register unorganized sector workers. Good, I mean, that is required. But just registering them, is that enough? Will they be guaranteed social security benefits? Same thing with the digital health portal. They want people's health data, but are they going to provide assured healthcare access to everybody? So I think these are the questions. So as somebody referred to earlier, probably, I think Ritu said that it's a card culture that is coming around. And so we get more and more identity cards, etc. But we don't get back what we should in terms of public services as taxpayers and so on. So this is the kind of background in which we are kind of operating. So we see that if you look at the social sector budget information, access is reduced considerably. For example, under NHM, National Health Mission, we used to get regular financial management reports, okay, prior to 2016. And which provided all the details that you need in terms of the benefits that were accruing. Though even those reports were not really kind of telling us gendered spending, I mean, how much was spent on men and women, but at least they were available in fair amount of detail. Post 2016, this has stopped. And because all now reports have to be approved by the PMO office. So this has happened not only with NHM, this has happened with ICDS, with midday meals. Midday meals, at least you get some data from the from the board, from the education board that is there, but not through the budget route. Similarly, another example, the PMJAY scheme, which is for tertiary care access for the below poverty line. I mean, that data is much less than what we used to get under RSBY in terms of details, where even gender data was available, age-wise data was available, and so on. Now this data is only used by Niti Aayog, which comes out with very biased reports on what is happening. So they kind of come out with reports which are pro-insurance, pro-private sector, so that's definitely a problem. So the government wants to use data to come out with its own reports and not leave it in public domain, so that academics, civil society, etc. can use that data to come out with critical reports. So similarly, I mean, Nirbhaya Fund, the domestic violence related schemes, etc. One does not see significant reporting happening except through Parliament questions. And also, many of these schemes do not actually get adequate resources also. They're not proportionate. Okay, just to give an example, we have maternity benefit, which is part of the NFSA, the National Food Security Act. And there's a certain mandate, 6,000 rupees. I think now the government has reduced it to 5,000 also. So so how should you budget for maternity benefit? I mean, if there are 2 crore births, for example, happening in the country, and at 6,000 rupees, you need a budget of 12,000 crores. So the current budget is what? Not even 2,000 crores at the allocation. I mean, Tamil Nadu has 18,000 rupees as maternity benefit, for example. So I think we need to create these benchmarks and then make allocations accordingly. So whether it's maternity benefit, whether it's healthcare, education, and whatever. So I think that is an important point to emphasize in terms of how budgets need to be built and developed. When we look at the overall budgets also, I mean, you see much less and less information. I mean, one example was which the question I had raised about the tax expenditures, revenue, so on. We get much less details today in the budget documents. We don't see outcome and performance budgets being produced, which would actually tell us how financial data kind of converges with benefits and who benefits and so on and so forth. So that is something which is completely missing. A lot of tampering of financial data happens. I mean, and the best example is in the last year's budget, when the government said we're going to spend 1,40,000 crores on healthcare, the central government. And they clubbed health and well-being and water supply and God knows what. And when actually the allocation of the Ministry of Health was 70,000 crores. So this is the kind of misleading compilations which we increasingly see in the budgets. I will not go into, I thought I'll talk about revenues also, but Malini has already covered revenue adequately. I agree that we need more wealth tax and more, we don't have wealth tax, so wealth tax, corporate tax, the way Jayati kind of described. So all these are definitely needed to increase the tax GDP ratio, which is one of the lowest in the world. I mean, compared and in the same category of income category. And then finally coming to gender budgets, I mean, I'm not an expert on gender budget, but whatever I've seen a little bit, what we get in terms of gender budget, and I think Jayati also mentioned this, is she called it a con. I mean, what you're telling us is through the gender budget is this is what we spent on certain women-specific programs where women are at the center. And that is not gender budgeting. Gender budgeting would be actually using the gender lens for the entire budget. Okay, because women are affected by malaria and TB also. So how do we, unless we get gendered information and then link it to access to the healthcare system in terms of gender, and then look at the resources which are spent on malaria and TB, you will not be able to come out with a gender budget. So that is not how. Kerala and Karnataka did, I mean, what I remember of the earlier gender budgets, they did attempt at least to go beyond these women-specific programs by looking at outcomes and then linking it to the spending that was happening. But that's been very limited. And most other states just follow what the center kind of produces. So I think another thing related to the gender budget that needs to be done is, I think we also need gender audits which have to go hand in hand. And this is where I think the CAG has to be brought in to, and they're quite open to doing that, because in one of the sessions I had with the CAG, they were open to these kind of social audits and then even gender audits to be doing that. So I think CAG should become an important stakeholder in enhancing the budget transparency. So finally, I mean, I was asked to also look at what should be the key asks in terms of transparency. Just to summarize, I've also sent it in writing to the FPC. So service delivery budget should be benchmarked, which I mentioned, to standards which fulfill citizens' demands. And all service delivery programs must have detailed financial management reports available in public domain. For example, health budget allocation should be a minimum 2.5% of GDP, for example. Or similarly for education, whatever, it's 5% or 6% and so on. And for each of the programs, whether it's ICDS or Nirbhaya Fund, MDM, one-stop crisis centers, etc., we need financial reports which actually talk about how people have benefited who avail those services, and not just how much was allocated. For many of these programs, you don't actually get actual spending also. Because the actual expenditures come in the finance reports of the CAG, which are not as detailed because they stop at the major subhead level. They don't go down to the line items. And the entire budget must be, which I've mentioned, subject to a gender lens and also accompanied with gender audit. So where the CAG should be involved, so that, or the CAG could also produce performance audit reports of departments which factor gender differentials. So that, I mean, so there are two ways of doing it: either to come separate independent gender audits, or see that your performance budgets indicate gender differentials. Then immediate doubling of health and education budgets is required, because these are two critical sectors which are drastically impacted during COVID, and they definitely need much more resources, and immediately, not in 5 years down the line or whatever. And finally, I think an important point I want to make is that there's a lot of discrimination and allocation of resources which happens to different segments of the population. And an example I generally use commonly is from health, where those who are covered by the central government health scheme, like our bureaucrats and members of parliament, they get rupees 9,000 per capita from the taxes as healthcare spending, whereas the Aam Janta gets 1,800 rupees per capita. So a huge kind of discrimination which we see. Same thing when a government official retires, they get 50% of the last drawn salary as pension. Whereas when it comes to old age pensions for the poor, you give them 500, 600 rupees per month in different states. So that's the kind of discrimination that is built in, which we need to kind of get rid of. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Ravi, for these inputs. Are all very important, very essential. And I think the increasing urgency of transparency, particularly in terms of the kind of fudging of figures which we had in the last budget. We'll take up questions. There are just 2 or 3 questions which are there. And then if anybody would like to add something in that, like I said, we might go 5-7 minutes beyond the time, which I think is all right. Now, there is one issue which I think has come at a broader level issue. One, Asha Ramesh raises and says that the child and women budget need to be separated, and most of the budget goes for child development, leaving very little for women's advancement. So that is one issue. And I think this we have been debating for a very long period of time. I think right from the 10th plan, 11th plan, when we were, some of us were part of the feminist economist group. And we kept saying that, please, I mean, again, in fact, in a way, one is reinforcing that the responsibility of children is only on women. by calling it a women and child budget, when it should, probably be child and youth budget. And a lot of calculations, which all of us, including Asha, has done for many states over many years, at 96 to 98% of the allocation under in many state governments goes for children rather than only for women. So that is one, and maybe one can expand that and also use it. Ravi, would you like to respond to this? Because you worked a lot on the Maharashtra budgets for a very long period of time.
Yeah, I mean, we need to, clubbing women and child may have some sense at some level, but I think we need to do it independently, and you need separate gender audits, and then for children, you can extend it elderly and so on and so forth. So different stakeholders will demand different kinds of disaggregations that are needed. But at least let's begin broadly with gender kind of analysis of the entire budget, and develop gender audits and so on, and other and then also for children, for elderly, and other categories, transgenders and so on. So
yeah, I mean, that's one category we just don't take into account. I mean, they don't exist in terms of any kind of a budget allocation which is there. And their situation, in fact, is one of the worst, because what field work some of us have done, many of us have done, is the transgenders are the most affected of absolutely the lot, and some commercial sex workers, of course. So there have been reports coming from UP, Bihar, Gujarat, MP, Chhattisgarh, many areas, and outskirts of the city of Mumbai, is that commercial sex workers were charging 7 rupees per encounter. Okay, and that's the desperation to which they had come. And at least some states have taken it up in terms of some kind of allocations to sex workers and to transgenders during the pandemic. So maybe that's a demand which we can make, is that they should be given some kind of a minimum income. And many of them thrown out of their houses, rented accommodations, etc., because they didn't have the money. So maybe that's a very specific issue which we should raise. I think in relation also to the context of a UBI, which we have not debated at all, that is the universal basic income. That, do we take it up? Let's calculate and see that if so many people below, a poverty line or whatever category we might take, that how much money would be needed. And I'm sure the calculations, several people, I mean, it's very easy, the person number, at least at a broad level. And maybe that's a very specific issue which we can take up, the UBI issue which is there. And also, at some level where the health aspect is concerned, the money which was there, whatever little bit was there for certain states, went primarily in fighting the COVID pandemic. And a lot of the money was taken away, and a lot of the support and the subsidies were taken away from other generic drugs, particularly relating to TB, to tuberculosis, and also to other aspects related to maternal mortality. And that is, the MMR rates in many areas have also increased. So that kind of allocation, and I know for the TB rebate and the subsidies to continue, we actually had to go to court, and we managed to get a hearing on that issue and an agreement on that issue. So, yeah, Yashoda, you wanted to add on?
Yeah. Can I ask a question?
Please.
Yeah. Ravi, this is a question for you. Thanks very much for bringing out the whole question of data transparency. I just wanted to check with you, for instance, you've been looking at some of the budgets and some of the data sets. Do you find any patterns? Because when the lockdown was happening and throughout the pandemic and sort of staggered lockdown phases, we found that regular health services were not working. Yeah. So, for instance, the whole maternity package, which included the Janani Shishu Suraksha Karyakram, the JSY, and of course, as you said, the maternity benefits. Then there are many other kinds of support and budgets provided for other illnesses, for other infectious diseases. Did you find any patterns in the data? And was the data available at all for those months, at least the 6 months starting April 2020? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, the data actually disappeared once the pandemic set in, and because the health ministry produces the health management information system, and the last report was ending March 2020, and after that, and it's a quarterly report which comes out every quarter, and it comes out on relatively on time, maybe the next month after the quarter is done. So that stopped for almost a year and a half. So only in 21, the 2020 quarterly reports started coming in. So there was a huge lag. And actually they had uploaded the June quarter 2020, which itself kind of showed, and I've written about this in one of my articles, which showed a decline of use even in that 3-month period, you know, from April to June. If you compare it to the previous year's April to June, you saw a huge decline in various services, vaccinations, deliveries happening in public institutions or even private hospitals,
Immunization,
access to TB drugs, various public programs. There was a huge decline even in that one quarter. And then subsequently, the other quarterly reports came much later. So I've still not looked at them. But yeah, one saw that in HMIS itself is a deficient kind of database. But even within that, one saw huge kind of declines, which showed the impact of COVID. And of course, COVID was not being reflected in the in that database. They have not added that separately, but we get it otherwise. So yeah, and many other kind of, we saw that the 2021 census has not been done. Okay, so of course there's a lot of debate happening on the caste, recording caste and things like that. But so we are not a decennial data that we get. I mean, let alone that, I mean, economic tables for 2011 census are not fully available. The occupational categories. If I want to know how many doctors are there in the economy and nurses and paramedics, that data is still not out. So for 2011, I mean, we are into the next census period. And so, yeah, delays are there in data. There's fudging happening, which we know with employment statistics and agricultural sector and so on and so forth. So there's a huge hiatus in data, and then that needs to be corrected. So it's an important issue that we need to push for authentic, more authentic data and timely data. I think that is important. I mean, if you get data after 2-3 years, it doesn't make sense. So more timely data and accurate data as yeah, and data which is not fudged. So.
Yeah, so just asking this, Ravi, because some of these schemes, like the ones that you just mentioned, they're also linked to specific expenditures. So if there is a sharp drop in the service provided, that means that money was not spent. So we found the same with maternity benefits. The money was not spent.
All the health money was going for COVID, you know, for oxygen cylinders, for, you know, enhanced kind of COVID care. So they did not bring in new money, which they should have done. Like Bombay's municipal corporation did do that. They brought in 2,000 crores extra into their budget. You know, so that was one good example I saw. Of course, it was not that, I mean, they did not reduce spending on other kind of routine care because people were not going to hospitals and dispensaries. So that was not being used. But they did put in some effort to bring in extra resources. Most governments did not, and especially the central government, despite having that PM Cares fund, and there's no transparency at all of that. So we don't know where those 40-50,000 crores, whatever is collected, we don't even know that.
Which included money from university salaries and doctor salaries, etc., which we know. So, Malini, would you like to add something? Malini?
Yeah, I mean, that what Ravi has been talking about, of the lack of availability of data, it impacts expenditure, but it also impacts how we understand what are the ways that revenue can be generated. In fact, we were working, Ravi is aware of it, with Ravi. We're trying to understand, let's say, for instance, how much extra revenue Maharashtra can generate to be able to deal with just one thing, increased expenditure on health. Believe me, we tried. The ones where it will not affect the general population, common people. And lack of data is not just in budget. It's lack of data is even in terms of, how much production has happened, how many cars have been sold, what are the different kinds of cars. So coming to the data problem is a big issue, of course. But I just wanted to also talk about a little bit about, when I said the fiscal policy today is in a bind for a number of tax policy reasons. There is this interesting issue of that's going on right now of bringing fuel taxes or fuel under GST. Now, of course, if it can be brought under GST, some would say it will be excellent. But it's not as simple as that, because GST is supposed to be neutral, revenue neutralizing, which means that what the government could earn prior to GST should be equivalent, more or less equivalent to what it can earn after GST. So for petrol to be brought under GST, it can no longer be taxed at 28%. Some have calculated that perhaps the tax rate will have to go up to 100%. So I'm not sure whether GST can be brought in unless we bring in much more progressive direct taxes. Because in the end, ultimately what happens is then the government loses revenue, so do state governments. And that is really not it for, that doesn't help anyone. So I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
Can I just add one small point? I mean,
please.
Talking about information not being available. I mean, actually, during our excise era, excise duty era, we did get detailed information on each production item. But during the GST regime, you don't get commodity-wise data that easily. And that was in an era when there was no digitization also. So it's a kind of a contradiction that when you have better information technologies, you are actually not providing information.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's part of the ruling strategy, So what I call majoritarian appropriation of everything, including data sources. And a certain changing and twisting of data at many levels. So that's why I really call it data for the government, as the current government, as a new urban Naxal. I mean, just anyways, we end of the session. Sorry for going on a bit beyond, but I think many important issues which have been raised. I mean, apart from transparency, the whole macroeconomic framework. What really are we looking at? Whether we are successful or not is a different kind of an issue. We have to raise exactly what we think is very essential. So does it help for us to, in this budget document, pre-budget consultation, and ask to calculate the unit cost of, say, a UBI or a minimum wage, or in terms of, say, the number of employed, and each one was to be given a minimum wage or whatever, 300 or whatever pathetic amount is being calculated now, how much really would it imply? And that includes paid and unpaid work. And the women who have left work, who've been forced to leave work, and who are not likely to come back. That is another very, very important aspect. So shall we get into the unit calculations? So that's one aspect, keeping whatever population projections and employment projections in mind. There are several very, very good surveys which have been done. Another, and taking off from Malini's, I think that's also extremely important, is the revenue component, revenue raising. I mean, should we put that? It cannot be, it can be an ask in the sense that, okay, your direct taxes must increase, but also to give options and say, where is the amount which is wasted? Because, now when Ravi was talking about 2,000 crores being raised by the Mumbai Municipal Corporation for fight on COVID. There was another 3,000 crores being wasted on the coastal road, you know, which the fisher folk and others have been opposing for a very long period of time. So shall we have a chart in this document when we finally prepare it in a few days, is the amount of revenue wasted, maybe taking 1 or 2 states as illustration, or only the center, and that revenue is actually available, money is available, and where should it be spent and how it should be spent and for whom it should be spent. So I'll stop here, keeping you from your lunch, but I think only 10 minutes beyond.
Thank you very much, Ritu, for chairing the session. Thank you so much, Ravi and Malini, for joining us and providing your very valuable insights. Thank you to all our participants who are very engaged. We can see your comments in the chat box. यदि आपको किसी चीज की अनुवाद चाहिए, कृपया चैट में उसका रिक्वेस्ट डाल दीजिए. वो अनुवाद के लिए हम कोशिश करेंगे और अगले सत्र में भी काफी हम लोग 2 भाषाओं में करने की कोशिश करेंगे. Thank you all very much. We are now breaking for lunch. I'm sure you all need a break as well. And we will reconvene sharp at 2. Thank you and enjoy your lunch.
Thank you.
Thank you. बंद करूं?